All right, so I just had a couple of quotes up here to get us started. I'm going to get into these as we go along. So I'll just get started with my lecture. So, and thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for taking your Friday afternoon to come here. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope it's exciting. I don't know. So despite what many predicted in the past, and today's global economy and the spread of capitalism has not wiped out the ideology of nationalism, the ways in which people think about themselves as being part of a nation, the ways in which they construct this identity of a nation. It's present not only in formerly colonized countries, many of which are still struggling to differentiate themselves from their former colonizers, but also in quote-unquote first world countries such as the United States. For example, since the terrorist attacks of September 11th and since we've had our military abroad, many people are taking a new look at whom or what they consider to be American. So as nationalists of every nation struggle to hold on to their past traditions and their sense of a shared history and community as a way to kind of define themselves, they also look to incorporate what they consider modern, to be able to put themselves on the same level as other modern nations of the world, to show their forward progress and their agency, their ability to act on the world level in the global economy. So in this national discourse, in this discussion of nationalisms, in formerly colonized nations, women have often been put in the role of keepers of traditions. And locked into this role, they're limited in their ability to move beyond tradition, to break free of those parts of tradition in particularly patriarchal societies that often limit their agency, their ability to act and do as they want. As keepers of tradition, women are also limited in their ability to participate in any advancements or changes in the nation, as well as to participate in the forming of the nationalist narrative as a whole. So I'd like to discuss how the nature of discourse on nationalism, how we think about nations, through the lens of one writer, Aidoo, through her fiction, as she portrays through her fiction the struggles her nation of Ghana has gone through after being colonized by the British. Writing in the decade after colonization, or after the nation gained independence, Aidoo explores the space women occupy in her nation's nationalist discourse and how much women are involved in forming a national narrative. So first, I'll give you a little bit of background on nationalism and post-colonial critical theory. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with that area of theory. And then we're going to look at Ghana at the time that No Sweetness Here was written. It was published in 1970. Then take a look a little bit at her background, Aidoo, and then I'm going to focus on Everything Counts, and I know the presentation abstract mentioned a couple of her other stories. I'm going to talk about those as we go through the critical theory, but and the handout is the short story Everything Counts. I thought I'd give a close reading of that because it's short enough so everybody can look at it right in front of them as we get to that part. So, and then just wrap up with some conclusions and questions. So first of all, post-colonial critical theory. So this theory explores the complex relationships between the colonized and the colonizer. So how once the colonizer has left and a nation has become physically independent or politically independent, the formerly colonized deals with this break. So the colonizer has had such an influence over the colonized lives, and many times over their spiritual beliefs, over even such things as their personal relationships, how they construct marriages, their governance, their laws, and in many cases has left a language as their legacy, a language that connects the colonized peoples together. They might have these different ethnic groups, might have their own language, and they're using the colonizer's language to communicate. So that they've had such an influence that when formerly colonized nations attempt to formulate or create or embody their own institutions and establish their own kind of culture and identity as a nation, these attempts are often inevitably entangled with the culture, institution, and even the discursive practices of the former colonizer. So post-colonial theorists then examine how subjects, how identities get formed in this space, how they emerge from these conflicting languages and cultures. And the field got much of its start with Edward Said's Orientalism, in which he discusses how the Orient was constructed through a system of othering, which I'll get to in a minute. According to Jonathan Culler, quote, since then, post-colonial theory and writing has become an attempt to intervene in the construction of knowledge and culture, and for intellectuals who come from post-colonial societies like Aidoo, to write their way back into a history that others have written, end quote. So this idea of the colonizers trying to figure out what their history, what their country is going to be, once the colonizer has left. So many of these people that are writing, many of the fiction writers or playwrights or anybody producing texts within this space, they either try and bring back an old traditional identity and kind of purify it from all of the influences of the colonizer, or they kind of construct a hybrid identity of some of their traditions and then some of the colonizers as well. So they're in kind of a problematic space. Inevitably, a central investigation in post-colonial theory in this theory then is the text of nationalist discourse. How do these nations identify themselves as a nation? Who is Ghanaian and who isn't? Who is in, essentially, and who is out? How do they decide this? So in looking at the nationalist discourse, how does one define oneself as American? How does one define oneself as Algerian or whatever nationality you are? The way we do this, how we define who we are is by defining who we are not, essentially. By making comparisons to other cultures, we set boundaries for our own. So nationalist rhetoric is essentially based on the system of othering. It's a way of cultural representation in which people imagined a kind of shared history, a shared community. One example of this is in South Africa, and Anne McClintock, a theorist in this area, talks about how in South Africa there was settlers that had come in from Europe that were from different countries of Europe, Dutch, the Portuguese, the French, and had settled in the South Africa area. And then once the British decided to come down and make it their colony, these disparate groups had to come together and unite and create some sort of national identity that was different from the Africans that were there before and also different from the British. And she says, in response to the British invasion and to other themselves from the Africans, the Afrikaners had to come up with a national identity, and they literally constructed a unified history. The movement, quote, invented white nationalist traditions and celebrated unity where none had existed before, end quote. And Arundhati Roy, in her essay, The End of Imagination, which is an awesome essay, she also agrees with this. She says, quote, we Indians need to feel beleaguered. We need enemies. We have so little sense of ourselves as a nation and therefore constantly need to cast about for targets to define ourselves against, end quote. And India is also a formerly colonized. It was colonized by the British, and it is made up of a variety of ethnic groups. So in forming this idea of nation, many colonized countries in the late 19th century were faced with the need to incorporate the technological and economic advances of the industrialized colonizers without becoming carbon copies, without essentially forgetting who they were before the colonizers came. So Partha Chatterjee says that in this setting, nationalist discourse was framed around this idea of public and private spheres. So this is how they negotiated, taking on some modern things, but then also keeping their history and their past. The public sphere encompasses the outside material world, a world in which the colonizer is dominant. This is a world of competition, it's a world of capitalism, it's the marketplace essentially, the world, and Chatterjee notes it's essentially the world of men. The private sphere, the domestic world of the household, is seen as the woman's sphere. And Chatterjee's illustration, I believe, is logical in theorizing the formation of the nationalist narrative, so thinking about these two spheres. Under this theory, nationalists realize they can modify the public sphere in their society and learn the methods of the dominant economic powers in order to compete with it, but then they can still preserve the shape of their private sphere, where they keep their true identities, their sense of spiritual beliefs, and those things that they keep kind of in the home. So in India, Chatterjee points out that Indians other themselves from the West by seeing that Indian culture as superior in the domestic sphere, and this is what he says. In fact, as Indian nationalists in the late 19th century argued, not only was it not desirable to imitate the West in anything other than the material aspects of life, it was not even necessary to do so because in the spiritual domain, the East was superior to the West. So in this way, they could gain some pride in who they were and negotiate, kind of taking on some changes, but not taking on changes everywhere. So if we're going to look at this type of negotiation, then where does that leave women in nationalist discourse? If the domestic sphere is to be preserved, then it is there that nationalists refuse to adapt any new ways that might help promote women's agency. Thus, Chatterjee points out nationalist movements in India evolved to resemble the traditional patriarchy of the Indian society, and women's issues were dropped. So soon after independence, this idea of women gaining agency in their communities was dropped. The woman's question. The position of the woman as a representative of the domestic sphere, she must remain static if the identity of the nation is to be protected. So nationalists associate any change by the woman in their traditional society as a reflection of Western influence. Thus, Denise Candioti notes, one Egyptian nationalist concludes that, quote, the liberation of women could only represent an unpatriotic development, end quote. And she goes on to note, there is a wealth of evidence to suggest that for women, the modern is always perilously close to the alien, since they're supposed to be protecting that kind of traditional identity. They don't want them to change. Especially, she notes, when the modern can be associated with an outright betrayal or reversal of what is expected of women in their communities. An example can be seen in Aidoo's In the Cutting of a Drink. Urban African women who see themselves as modern, during this time of industrialization, a lot of people moved from the farms and into the cities for work, including women. And as seeing themselves as modern, they would go out dancing until late at night, out into the public sphere and ordering drinks. But this was in direct opposition to the traditions of the African society in which the story is placed. Traditions that say a woman should not be out in these public spaces, particularly with men that she doesn't know. And the male narrator discussing the woman in the city says, quote, yes, I remember very well. She asked for a beer. I was too surprised to drink mine. I sat with my mouth open and watched the daughter of a woman cut beer like a man, end quote. So in this type of nationalist narrative, women are also used as boundary markers for their particular nationalist groups. And when they're considered boundary markers, then they're not allowed essentially to move. They have to stay as boundary markers. And they're objectified, and they are objectified, and their agency as subjects is lost as these boundary markers. So in the construction of a nation, woman is often only present in her relationship to man, as wife or as mother, in this idea of what the nation is. So the men are the actors on the stage of nationalism, and the women are there by their relationship to the men. And Candioti notes, quote, women bear the burden of being mothers of the nation, as well as being those who reproduce the boundaries of ethnic national groups, who transmit the culture, and who are the privileged signifiers of national difference. So if they're going to transmit the culture, then they need to make sure that they keep that culture and stay static in some ways. So women in Aidoo's short story, Note Sweetness Here, place their values of themselves on how many children they can produce, those women that were in the traditional villages. So there were these urban women, but then there were also women that stayed in the traditional villages in the farming communities. And in fact, their duty as women was to produce offspring. In a gift from somewhere, the narrator, a woman, she is losing her another child. She has had a series of babies, and they've all died, and now her next child is on his deathbed, and she's torn about how she keeps continuing to go through this process of having children. And she says, quote, she reflects on her position, and she says, quote, now all I must do is try and prepare myself for another pregnancy, for it seems this is the reason why I was created. Or is there another way out of it all? Where does this road lie? I shall have to get used to it. It is the pattern set for my life. So she realizes that there is no other road for her, particularly in her community. So if we're to take on Chatterjee's theories of public and private spheres, and the national discourse, where does that place it? It is essentially, because it's kind of a public discourse, it's in the men's sphere, but it affects what goes on in the private sphere, in a woman's home. So although a nationalist discourse may belong in the material outer world, outer sphere of males, nationalist discourse still affects life in the inner sphere. War is waged in the public sphere over the territory of the female in the domestic sphere. McClintock notes this in the writings of Frantz Fanon, who wrote a lot about this relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. But she points out that in much of his writing, he focuses on the colonizer as being a man. He doesn't really address as much the women's issue in his writing. And she says, in particular, she quotes him as saying, the fantasy of the native is to occupy the master's place. So the idea that the native or the colonized is fantasizing about becoming the husband to the colonizer's wife. And she says, quote, "The white woman is seized, possessed, and taken hold of, not as an act of substitution." So Fanon thought of it as an act of substitution, focusing on what happens with the men, but as an act of appropriation, where the man appropriates the wife of the colonizer. McClintock goes on to say, "The generic category of native does not include women in Fanon's work. Women are merely possessed by the male native as an appendage." So women, in other words, are objectified essentially, and again, they lose their agency in nation building. They become the territories rather than the subjects of the nation. And so when they do manage to participate in fighting the revolution, it's often couched in these terms that, yes, it's their duty as self-sacrificing and be patriotic and fight this revolution, but then as soon as the revolution is over, or now you're expected to return to your homes, to the domestic space, and leave the rest of nation building to the men who can change and can be in the outer sphere. So basically, that's kind of the background on nationalism and post-colonial theory. So now we're going to look at Ghana at the time of No Sweetness Here, and how does it kind of compare to what I've just talked about. So that's all the theory about what people say goes on. Now let's take a look at a nation that's actually going through this. So this is Ghana here. It's on the western coast of Africa here, and it's this green country right here, next to Togo, below Burkina Faso. So Ghana at the time, before the Europeans came, Ghana was a collection of various tribal states. First the Portuguese, then the Dutch, and then the British traveled along the coast starting in the late 15th century, and they set up trading posts. Some of them were trading companies, and so at some points these posts were controlled by the companies. At other times they were taken over by the governments of the people, the government to which these people belonged. The Europeans allied themselves with some groups, such as the Fanti, or some coastal groups, and then they would fight against the other groups that were there. So sometimes they would use the natural enemies against each other to gain control of the coast. With the decline of trade in the 1800s, the British purchased the last remaining fort from the Dutch, and they finally took over, and they were finally able to conquer the Asante to the north, which was a powerful group to the north, in the northern part of Ghana, and then they also had these additional northern territories, and they consolidated all of them under what they called a protectorate called the Gold Coast, mainly because some of the trade that was done in the area was in gold. That was one of the minerals found in Ghana. And they set up a sort of indirect rule, and by which they allied themselves with the regional tribal chiefs, and these chiefs ruled originally by both birthright, because they were from royal families, but they also ruled by popular consent. So people could take them out of power if they didn't like the way that the chief was ruling. But when the British came along and started using them as rulers, these chiefs were soon more tied to the British commissioners, their power bases, than they were to their people. So this idea of popular consent slowly diminished. And the British also used them as a way to transmit their types of laws and their types of governance to the outer people, to the people outside the cities. So after the British, I think I just missed my place. Yeah, there we go. Next one. However, during this time, there were also groups that did arise to try and represent Ghanaian interests, the interests of the people that were there in terms of their own voice and having their own power. But they weren't very powerful until a little bit later, when dissatisfaction started growing, because in the early 1900s, the education system developed in Ghana, and much of the wealthier Ghanaians were able to send their children abroad to be educated. And then these children came back with an education, and they had broadened their horizons, and they came back to be in some sort of leadership role, and they could not find a place for themselves. And there was also others, veterans of wars, the World War I and World War II. There were Ghanaians that went abroad to represent British interests, and they also returned and found that there was really no space for them, particularly in the post-war years. There was a lot of inflation and unemployment, a lot of economic instability that led to this rising dissatisfaction with the fact that they had no voice in their own government. So in 1947, the United Gold Coast Convention was founded by a group of these educated elite. with the intent to move Ghana toward independence, quote, in the shortest possible time. They wanted to replace the traditional chiefs in the British system of indirect rule with educated citizens. They had returned in their eyes to lead their country, and the colonizers should, and they had returned in their eyes with this education that they had gotten abroad, oftentimes in Britain itself, and they felt like, they have this education, they know now, and the colonizers should respect them as being able to lead their own country. And some of the symbols of this time in their movement was youth, progress, science, freedom. So these kind of terms that they used to kind of group their ideas about what they wanted. There were several activists abroad that were welcomed home or invited back home to participate in this movement, and one of them was Kwame Nkrumah. And he came back home, and he was part of the UGC, but he felt like they weren't working fast enough. So he broke from them, and he formed his own party, the Conventional People's Party, in 1949, which called for immediate independence. And rather than just associating with just the educated elite, he also appealed to the middle class of teachers and journalists, and there was a new growing group of urban workers that had left the farms to come into the city, and so he really is getting a real popular appeal among them. So in 1957, the British finally allowed an election for the formation of a new constitution, and Ghana was declared independent. It was the first colony in West Africa to gain its independence. And the nation took on the name of Ghana, which was actually the name of a powerful African empire that was several hundred miles northwest of present-day Ghana that reigned from the 5th to the 13th century. So instead of taking a name from one of the ethnic groups, they took the name of this kind of a past Pan-African empire. And Nkrumah, of course, was the first prime minister and president of this, was elected as first prime minister and president. So as Nkrumah notes in his own writings, he wanted to modernize quickly without, quote, getting hindered by reactionary politics, end quote. So he believed in a strong central government, while his opposition, so after he was elected, there was some growing opposition to him, supported a federal style with regional representation. So what does he do? One of his first acts was to abolish the regional assemblies. So getting rid of these kinds of regional representation. And then he started putting all his cronies in positions of power. And then in 1960, he established a new constitution which created a single party system so that there was no other parties that could be in an election against his party. And then that same constitution also made him president for life. So he then pushed through some unpopular austerity measures, which may have been needed at the time, but were particularly unpopular because they raised the taxes and the price for the country's major export is cocoa, which Ghana's the second leading exporter of cocoa today. Their prices for cocoa was dropping, and he started jailing his opponent, and by 1964, he also gave himself power to remove any judge at any time, so that if somebody did want to get out of jail, and the judge said, okay, he could remove that judge and put somebody else in. So basically, in short, he creates another authoritarian regime. So how could this happen that when Ghana struggles for freedom, they end up with another authoritarian regime that allows no dissenting voices? Well, the seeds for this could be seen in a bit of the nationalist rhetoric before independence. As Neil Lazarus points out in post-colonial African fiction, the general rhetoric of anti-colonialism was reductive. It implied that there was only one struggle to be waged, and it was a negative one, a struggle against colonialism, not a struggle for anything specific. So it never paused long enough to give its ideal of freedom a content. So they never really thought about what is this freedom going to look like once we get it. Again, like we were talking about before with post-colonial theorists, the idea is there's this unity that comes about when there's an aggressor, but then once the aggressor is gone, what are we or who are we now? What is this freedom going to look like? So once the common enemy, the colonizer, was gone, the sense of unity dissolved. What he did was similar to what other national leaders have done following independence. They simply replaced the colonizer with themselves, an upper class, often educated abroad, and educated under a system of Western values and governance and laws. So it made it very easy for them to step into the shoes. As Frantz Fanon notes in The Wretched of the Earth, quote, "The national bourgeoisie steps into the shoes of the former European settlement. Its mission has nothing to do with transforming the nation," end quote. So example of this is in For Whom Things Did Not Change. The main character is a war veteran who can't find work after the war, and so he realizes that they're offering training to make people stewards or servants in a British government rest house, and he doesn't want to do it. He feels like that kind of cooking and cleaning for people is beneath him, but there are not a lot of jobs, so he ends up doing it. And his part of the rest house has no running water or electricity under the British system. But once the independence is gained, the new government decides to renovate the rest house to make it look better. And so he talks to the builders, and he thinks that he's going to get electricity and running water because the builders say, oh, it's really easy to add. But they don't give it to him. So even though it's easy for them to renovate it and give him running water and electricity, they don't. Purposely, they don't give it to him. And he notes, quote, "My own people who are big men do not think I should use these good things they use. Something went out of me then which has not returned since. For a long time I was drinking, but now the anger is gone and I stay here." And he finishes the story with the question, what does independence mean? And for him it goes back to the title, For Whom Things Did Not Change. So after independence, nothing changed for him. He was basically under the same set of rules that he had been under before. And it hurts him even more because now it's not British people, but Ghanaians that are putting him in this position. So that's basically Ghana at the time of No Sweetness Here. So the educated classes are privileged in having received education and often went abroad, but when they come back, they're caught in this conflict between the traditional ways and the modern values and what to take up and what not to take up. And for women and men, it's different in how they negotiate that, and that's kind of what Ama'ata Aidoo deals with in No Sweetness Here. And in Ketu Kratrak, in an afterwards to the set of short stories, says, "This type of dilemma faces educated women doubly since they can be ostracized further from their communities for challenging the patriarchal status quo." So there was a difference in how men were treated when they came back from abroad than how women were treated. So now that I've talked about Ghana, I'm going to talk a little bit about Ama'ata Aidoo. There she is. And a little bit about her background. So she was born in Ghana to royalty. Her father was a chief, and her mother, she got a lot of her storytelling abilities from her mother. Her mother, she said in one interview that she used to awake to her mother talking stories. And if you read her set of short stories, she recreates some of that oral storytelling in the way she sets up these short stories. There's a couple of them that just open with a general discussion among women, and you don't really know who any of the characters are, but you feel like you're sitting in a community listening to women talking among themselves. Her grandfather stood up against the British and was tortured to death in a colonial prison. And she notes in an interview with Adiola James, quote, "Looking back to my parentage, I think I come from a long line of fighters. I have always been interested in the destiny of our people," end quote. Her father did believe in educating women, and so many women would go to primary school in the elite classes, and perhaps high school at the time, but no further than that. But she went to high school along the coast, and then she ended up publishing her first story at the age of 16, and then her second story, No Sweetness Here, which was republished in this collection, won her a spot at the 1962 African Writers Workshop in Nigeria, and then she later went on to graduate from the University of Ghana in 1964. That same year, she produces her first play and publishes that play, and so by the age of 23, she had produced and published her first play. And this was right after then. They had gained independence in 1957. She had published in 1958 her first story. So this is right around the time of Nkrumah's ruling. So she went on to attend, actually she went abroad briefly to attend a creative writing program at Stanford University, but returned to Ghana as a research fellow at the University of Ghana, and then moved to Tanzania and Kenya for short periods of time. And so this is around the time that No Sweetness Here was published, and she taught at universities there, and then she came back to Ghana to teach at the Cape Coast from 1972 to 1982, and she was also an activist in Ghana and held positions on at the Ghana Broadcast Corporation, the Arts Council, the Medical Dental Councils, and she actually in 1982 served as Minister of Education for 1 year, Minister of Education in Ghana. But then she eventually left to continue writing, and her writing and teaching brought her back to the United States, where she served as visiting professor at Brown University, and she was there for the last 7 years and just recently stepped down in December of 2010. So in sum, she has written several novels, 2 novels, 2 sets of short stories, two sets of poems, and she also has several essays in which she talks about the position of women in African society. And she doesn't just critique how Ghanaians attempt to negotiate both a call for modernization and a unified traditional identity in post-colonial society. She also looks at how the line between public and private is blurred in her writings. She notes herself in an interview, quote, "Even in terms of the relationship between a man and a woman, the factors that affect the relationship are very often outside themselves and have to do with the structure, with economics, with political reality." So she's saying that even in personal relationships, so that's why they enter her story so often. She also expresses her own views on how women are constructed in Ghanaian society. She says, since men have been the majority in organizing society, of course, we have inevitably fallen into the role of the other. So it's almost as though outside their prescribed roles, prescribed traditional spaces, women are looked upon as some kind of threat. It's almost as if our very existence as the other human being is regarded as something that has to be watched and possibly organized outside ourselves. She was speaking to this idea that post-colonial theorists had talked about, this idea that they need to be kind of controlled because they are these keepers of what they construct as traditions, whether or not they're real African traditions or not is also questionable, which she notes, because she goes on to say that many West African societies were matrilineal, not matriarchal, but matrilineal, which meant that the inheritance were passed from grandmother to granddaughter. And the men were still heads of the household, but they ruled by proxy. They ruled for the women in some sense. So there was a little bit of balance or checks on the powers in that. And she notes in that society, and she belongs to the Akan society, which is one of these matrilineal, she says, being a woman is enormously important in Akan society. In her own essay on the status of women in Africa, she notes, quote, on the whole, African traditional societies seem to be at odds with themselves as to exactly what to do with women. For although some of them appear to doubt gender and biology as a basis for judging women, so some of them do realize that there should be some sort of balance in power. In the end, they all use gender and biology to judge women's capabilities. She adds, some of us are convinced of something else, that much of the putting down of women that educated African men indulge in and claim is African culture is warmed up leftover from colonization. So the influence of the colonizers' culture. Her life as writer, teacher, and activist are inextricably intertwined. She notes, quote, I would have to admit that I haven't written a single novel, play, or poem that is not political. Not to write in this way would be to commit violence to my own imagination. So let's take a look at a reading of Everything Counts. And we can kind of now that we've got this idea of what post-colonial theory is and what Ghana was like and Ama-Ata Aidoo and her ideas, we can apply it now as we look at this short story. So just a quick summary. The central figure in this story is a Ghana woman who studies economics abroad, and while abroad she has discussions with her male classmates who are also studying abroad about the revolution and changes in the nation. And the men bring up this issue of women wearing wigs and that they see it as a serious issue. But the main character, the woman in the story, and she doesn't have a name, she's just called her or she. The woman in the story doesn't quite feel that way about it. She doesn't see it as quite that serious. She marries a Ghanaian and then she returns home, and once she returns home, she realizes kind of what they were talking about, the men were talking about when they were abroad. So like I said, the story starts with her talking to her male classmates, and she says that she envies them in some ways because she says, quote, it was so much easier for them to talk about the beauty of being oneself, to talk about being African and being proud of it, not to struggle to look like white girls, not straightening one's hair, and above all, not to wear the wig, end quote. So the African men, as students who studied abroad, could return home and be welcomed by African women in a nation that now stressed education in men. If the colonized were to compete with the colonizer, then the men needed to be educated in the material global world. But women, however, were not to change, not to wear, in this case, wigs. It would be better if they were not in the global world at all. When women wear a wig, the men see that wig as a symbol of Western white influence over women, whom they hold as the trustees of their culture. If women are changed or influenced by the West, the African culture in some way is eroded. So the men demonize this wig as a figure of this erosion. As the story's main character reflects, she notes, and this is on page 1 as well, quote, extremists are sure they are made from the hairs of dead white folk, end quote. If the hair from the wig came directly from white people, it would be the ultimate physical intrusion of whites, of the colonizers, into the African home, the domestic sphere. Also, the fact that the hair comes from dead white folk, that it is cast off, is another way in which they're always striving to be like whites, but they cannot actually become white. She says that when she thought of this, she would, quote, shiver for all the world to see, end quote, because when it puts in that way, it does seem very terrible thing. So when she asks the male African students when she goes on to ask them, how does that relate to the revolution? They respond, because it means we have no confidence in ourselves. And that is on page 2. She understood what they meant, she says. Wearing a wig shows that the African look is not good enough. The white look is better, more beautiful, something to be admired, something to be imitated. She sees this as exactly one reason why women are wearing the wig. They are forced to compete with white women when men in the material Western world are attracted to all that is Western and white, even white females. So on the bottom of page 2, she adds, quote, as for imitating white women, what else can one do, seeing how some of our brothers behave, end quote. So how are African women expected to compete with white women when they're not expected in any way to change? And she goes on to say that despite these issues, the woman in the story at first doesn't see the issue of wearing wigs as serious. She didn't see how the wigs really had anything to do with the revolution and the forming of a nation. She didn't really see that it was all that symbolic. For her, wearing the wig, she notes on page 3 that it was just an easy out. It was more of a convenience when she wore the wig. She thought of it as like a hat, a turban. She didn't really see it as this evil figure that they were making it out to be. And she thinks they're making too big a deal out of it. So even though they point out some of these things. And she says that she basically wants to refocus the discussion. She says, listen, my brothers, if we honestly tackled the problems facing us, we wouldn't have the time to worry about such trifles as wigs. So we have bigger problems than whether or not women are wearing wigs, is what she's saying. So that made them angry enough that if she wasn't careful, quote, they would destroy her, and that's on page 2. That kind of hatred for the wig, so harsh, frightened her. Arguments and differences among men and women, as she sees it, were not on such a scale in the old days. In the old days, however, men probably didn't see as much at stake when a woman argued with them or when they wanted to change in this way. But there's more at stake for them now. She realized the men were determined to keep women static figures, objects in the process of nation building. And also the women were outwardly showing what the men did not want to admit, that their attraction to white females or to whiteness itself. So in some ways, their wearing the wig was showing them something about themselves. As for the revolution, she notes, quote, if they, the men, really wanted to see a revolution, why didn't they work constructively in other ways for it? So instead of talking about wigs, why aren't they actually out there working for the revolution? And when she said this to them, her male friends couldn't respond to this because basically they weren't willing to give up their own personal dreams, their own personal goals of basically earning money or in the end staying abroad and getting further education and not returning to Africa. She says they were not willing to give up their personal dreams, which, quote, stood between them and any meaningful actions they ought to take, end quote. So when she arrives home, however, so this is while she's abroad, but when she arrives home, her ideas kind of change. Her views change. The wig took on a new meaning for her. It was not worn discreetly, and she sees this even with the flight attendants on the plane as she's going home, but then she sees it when she's at home. They didn't wear the wig discreetly as she had worn it. For her, it was more of a replacement, like I was talking about, a change. But they wore it, quote, blatantly, aggressively, crudely. And in addition to wearing the wig, many women had also lightened their skin color, and she talks about them looking as if they're walking around with masks on. And she didn't want to ask why this was being done because she'd appear more of a stranger than she wanted to, a stranger in her own country, a stranger, and she had imagined returning to this new country where, of course, she was going to feel like she was a big part of it, and suddenly she doesn't feel like she's a part of it. She had left to learn economics, and she was looking forward to teaching her students about the important economic aspects of nation building. As students in economics, quote, their role in nation building was going to be crucial, much more than the big-mouth, big politicians, big living politicians. They could do vital work to save the continent from the grips of its enemies, end quote. That's on page 4. So these big politicians, and Aidoo uses this term throughout her short stories, big people, represented the class of society that had replaced the colonizer. It represented Nkrumah and his buddies and some of these educated people that came back and basically continued the structures that were there before. She said that these people were only working for the good of themselves, not for the good of the country. They only served to keep the constructs and structures of colonialism alive, or this is kind of what she's thinking, alive with them as the new colonizers, and the new colonized are the rest of the Africans. So when her students, so she teaches her first class, and when her students come in all made up with wigs and Western looks, she wished she could laugh it off like she used to blow it off not as serious like she used to when she was abroad. But she admits that she couldn't help but feel a certain jealousy. They made her feel old with her wiglessness, even though she was only slightly older than them. She was only 4 years older than the seniors in the class. She felt like she had learned what they needed to learn abroad, which was economics, and she didn't need some sort of false modernization that they were bringing on. She had something real. She recalls how the students were, quote, were once, quote, little frightened lost creatures from villages and developing slums who had come to the citadel of an alien culture to be turned into ladies, ... quote, on page 5. And she kind of trails off on this, and this idea of that the city was an alien culture, this modern, quote-unquote modern culture was alien, and they took on this colonial term to be turned into ladies. Why did they have to aspire to become ladies? They should have their own sense of identity, carve a new place and a new positioning that wasn't based on the old colonial structures, or even on those two spheres of the public and the private, the traditional and the modern. The traditional that the men had talked about, where you are not to wear any wigs at all, and then the modern, where they're wearing these kind of, they're blatantly and aggressively wearing these wigs. So seeing her students' wigs made the narrator hear once again the arguments of the Africans abroad. The African men abroad. They had said, quote, you still got to admit that there is an element in this wig wearing that is totally foreign, unhealthy, end quote. So maybe she didn't totally agree wholeheartedly that women should be keepers of tradition, but she did realize that the little things mattered. When her relatives called her to come home, she was amazed and embarrassed that they were asking her what kind of car she was driving and whether or not she'd be bringing them a refrigerator. She saw these items as, quote, ropes with which we are hanging ourselves, unquote. They represented status symbols, false power shows, not real changes for the good of a nation. They represented a false modernity, a false progress, and she, as an economist, wanted to bring about a real progress. She wanted to take what she had learned abroad and fit it to her nation to change the way business was done. But when they hung themselves on these ropes that she called, she gets depressed and thinks, quote, and this is on page 2, perhaps her people had really missed the boat of original thinking. So coming home, she didn't recognize her country. It didn't match up to the idea she had of this nation while she was abroad. And while they had discussed the nation abroad, they kind of imagined what this nation was going to look like. And she had her own ideas of what it was going to look like. It didn't look like a new nation of Africans that she had imagined, a nation not imitating the West, but also not stagnant in some created African traditions, a new nation based on a new idea of nationality. She wonders if she arrived too late or too soon. The embodiment of the problem for her was at the end of the story. She goes to see a women's beauty contest. She doesn't really want to go, but somehow she's kind of drawn to it. And all the women she sees in the contest, she says that she considered none of them to be beautiful. And the one that ends up winning is the one that had the fairest skin and the most luxuriously long hair. She said the image of this makes her so sick that she actually comes home and vomits. And she now understands why the men that were abroad were too frightened to come home. The nation they wanted, a nation strong in economics and the material world, but traditional in family and women's roles, that's what they had imagined, did not exist. And it didn't help that they didn't come home to help build it. So she talks about at the end of the story how they continue on to go get masters or PhDs and stay abroad and don't come back to this nation. So some overall conclusions. In the nationalist discourse portrayed in the story, when the lines of public and private and the roles of women and men are muddied in any way or blurred, that causes problems for the person who straddles this line, particularly the woman in the story. So as a woman economist, the narrators are participating in the public world and learning the process of global economics, but she still wants to preserve what she feels is good about Ghana. She does not believe that they should change everything to start imitating the West. She feels that she is showing that women can participate in nation building and not be held as the bearers of tradition, but yet she still can't help feeling left behind or old when she's put in front of this classroom of women that have all these wigs on and have changed the way they look. She can't quite find a place in the new Ghana as she is. So, and that's kind of her dilemma in the end, is that she struggles to find this spot. She argues against the nationalist discourse that delineate no room for women's agencies. The narrator points out that although women shouldn't be burdened with keeping any and every tradition, they should not just take on everything that they consider to be quote-unquote modern. To compete. Ghana's women should not attempt in the narrator's view to become what they are not, which is white women. The wig should not mean that much, but in the end she sees how when worn the way they wear it, it can, how, quote, everything counts, as the title of the story says, when taken to extremes. So women should find their own place in a new nation, neither grasping for a false modernity, nor strictly adhering to a patriarchal tradition. And then she also, this story also brings out what Aidoo wants to say about men, which on the other hand, need to compete with the first world nations in technology and commerce, but they do not need to fully immerse themselves abroad and forget about the nation that awaits them, like the students in the story did. They should not take what they have learned and use it to reach their own personal goals, to become big people, but they should use it to better the nation as a whole. So overall conclusions, so that was from the story, but thinking about the story in relation to post-colonial theory, as post-colonial theorists have pointed out, in much post-colonial nationalist rhetoric, women as keepers of tradition are not allowed to change to make any improvements in their situation. They're objectified, they're boundary markers, and they're validated only in terms of their relationship to men as wives and mothers if they are keeping these traditional roles. They're expected to be moral and self-sacrificing. In Aidoo's Ghana, however, urban women would break out of those roles as keepers of tradition when they went into the cities and were out in the clubs dancing and that type of thing. But when they did that, in this way, they hoped to catch the eyes of the big men, the rich Africans who had supplanted the former colonists. But these false trappings of modernity, however, did not help them. Male nationalists abroad and traditional villagers at home, both of them frowned upon this break from tradition, and while in the eyes of the big people, they could never really become the epitome of the modern Western beauty, so they constantly strive for something they could never really become. It sets them in this odd position. In the nationalist narrative I've outlined here, women can either follow traditional roles and lose their agency or break free from tradition, as the narrator seemed to find, and then they are in some sort of empty space. They can't really find a place for themselves. So in forming the nationalist narrative, critics need to examine closer what space the narrative carves out for women. What kind of a nation might be imagined with the input of women? Nationalism must be a discourse in which both men and women can participate on equal footing. No one gender should be epitomized and representative as the old, while the other is allowed to change and progress and form the new nation. And that's it. Questions?